Hello, everyone. I'm Kathleen Stevens in Washington, D.C. from KEI offices. I apologize for the late start. We've had some technical difficulties, but I want to welcome everyone, including our two speakers joining us from Seoul and from Europe, respectively, for our discussion today on the Republic of Hello, Korea. Everyone. I'm Kathleen Stevens in Washington, D.C. from KEI offices. I apologize for the late start. We've had some technical difficulties, but I want to welcome everyone, including our two speakers joining us from Seoul and from Europe, respectively, for our discussion today on the Republic of Hello, everyone. I'm Kathleen Stevens in Washington, D.C. from KEI offices. I apologize for the hybrid turns out to be difficult. Start again. I'm going to make a third try to start our hybrid webinar, where this is our first one, and to try this hybrid format. And I appreciate everyone's forbearance as we get through this effort. But I am really pleased to welcome three distinguished speakers to join us today in person here in Washington, as well as those who have very kindly joined us from other time zones remotely. Our topic today, I think, merits this effort. It is the Republic of Korea and the Indo-Pacific. And of course, we are doing it at the beginning of a week, which will see the visit of President Moon Jae-in, South Korea's president, for his first in-person summit with President Biden later this week. I am going to leave most of the time here, all of the time, to our speakers. The Indo-Pacific is a term that's been around for quite a while now. It's much in use in the Biden administration. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, it poses a lot of big questions for South Korea, particularly in the context of rising U.S.-China rivalry and the Biden administration's commitment to working bilaterally, multilaterally with allies, and to maintain a existing rules-based order in the region, and including through initiatives like the Quad. So I hope we'll get to all of that today and more. South Korea, I know, is watching all these issues, particularly before the summit, very, very carefully. And South Korea does face, in this geopolitical environment, many political, security, and diplomatic challenges. Our experts today are an extraordinary group. I'm going to introduce all of them very briefly in the order they'll be making some comments, and then I hope we will have, as much as this format allows, a very free-flowing and active discussion. First, we have with us Dr. Kim Gi-jung, who is the president of the Institute for National Security Strategy, INSS, joining us from Seoul. He is a very distinguished professor who long taught at Yonsei University's Department of Political Science and International Studies. He has also advised numerous Korean governments and presidents in the Office of National Security, in the Blue House, and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Unification and National Defense. And he has a PhD from the University of Connecticut. I know he's also a poet, but we may not have time for that today. Ambassador Chris Hill is a former career diplomat and a four-time ambassador, including to the Republic of Korea. He was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 into 2009, during which time he was also the leader of the U.S. delegation of the six-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue. He is at Columbia University School of International Public Policy, and I'm also very pleased that he has joined KEI as a distinguished fellow. I'm very pleased to welcome Admiral Scott Swift, who served in the U.S. Navy for more than 40 years, rising from the Aviation Reserve Officer Candidate Program to become a Navy light attack and strike fighter pilot. He commanded at all levels, including the U.S. 7th Fleet, forward deployed to Japan, and completing his uniform career as the 35th Commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet in 2018. He's founder of the Swift Group, LLC, and we're very pleased to have him join us. Dr. Ashley Tellis, I regard as a friend and an advisor on all things Indo-Pacific and especially India and South Asia. He is now the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He also previously served in the U.S. government, working in the State Department for the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and at the NSC as a special assistant to the president for strategic planning and Southwest Asia. And he is also an advisor to the chief of naval operations. So we do have a little bit of a maritime theme going. And last but not least, we're really pleased that Dr. Liselette Okar is joining us. She is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. She has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University, the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the Norwegian Nobel Institute. She's the author of many, many monographs, edited books, articles, and research papers on Chinese, European, and Indo-Pacific security. Her current research project, which we've been following very closely, includes Europe's role in between US-China strategic competition, China's role in the Arctic, and China's influence on overseas development assistance. So without further ado, we're going to get started, and I'm going to turn to Dr. Kim first, knowing that it's 10 p.m. on a Monday evening. Welcome. We look forward to your thoughts and your engagement.
Thank you, Ambassador Stevens. Thank you for the invitation to the wonderful webinar, Navigating Troubled Water, the Republic of Korea and Indo-Pacific. I think this is a timely and appropriate, occasion just before our president visit to Washington, D.C. So this is a special greetings from Seoul, and this is 10 o'clock in the evening. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And especially I like to say hello to Ambassador Hill. It's been quite a long time to see you. I'm very happy to see that nowadays that the Boston Red Sox is good performance. I was asked to speak about the Koreans' perceptions, Koreans thinking about the Indo-Pacific, but before that, I like to explain very briefly the Koreans' mindset regarding the Koreans' foreign relations, Korea's relations with the outside world. I think that the word Indo-Pacific has two different meanings to Koreans. One is Indo-Pacific as a region, to which the Koreans' diplomacy could and should reach out, to their place. And the second meaning to, as Indo-Pacific to Koreans, this means something, a symbol of, something about coalition. Now, recently, emerging coalition, which can be not only a challenge, but also the good opportunity to the Koreans. Diplomacy or the foreign policy, this matters to Koreans. Historically, many Koreans believe that the fate of Korea and the fate of Koreans has been determined by the political, determination outside, by the foreign powers. Going back to the, 19th century, that the Koreans has become a target of the imperialist competition, especially between China and Japan, and Russia and Japan, and also the colonization or liberation, or even division of the Korean Peninsula, or even Korean War, and after that the long-standing the confrontation. All of this tragedy is an outcome of the international affairs. So the Koreans, it is very natural that the Koreans believe that our fate has been determined by the outside world. At the same token, and there are many Koreans to believe that our future will be determined by the diplomacy, the foreign policy, or the Koreans' relationship with the outside world. So many people believe that we should focus and our ideas and energies to the foreign policy and our diplomacy. Looking back the 70 or more years of the out of case diplomacy, Republic of Korea's foreign policy, the main focus has been how to survive. Survival discourse has been central to the Korean foreign policy. So many people describe the South Korea foreign policy in the past has been US-centered diplomacy. So I think that was that choice was very much successful. But the many South Korean governments, even though the bilateral alliance with the United States has been very much successful to assure our security, many governments has suggested to our people that the alliance plus something else, alliance plus balancing diplomacy, alliance plus multilateral diplomacy. Recently, the South Korean diplomacy, we are deeply concerned with the, as long as we believe that our diplomacy will determine our future, that we have concentrated on our several key concepts by which we can face with the future. One is the middle power. Not only in terms of size, but in terms of a position. I think there's Koreans and South Koreans is located in between the big powers. So in that sense, we are in the position of a middle power. So another key word, the South Korean believes that the hybrid position would be important. Or we can say that this is, breaching state, the role of the breaching state by which we can connect with the, maritime power and the continental power. And also we believe that the breaching state would be, we could play a certain role as a breaching state because we are able to connect with advanced countries in terms of economy and the developing countries. That we can share our experience in the policy performance as the developing countries. Third concept that we can consider it is diplomatic flexibility. Flexibility means that South Korean diplomacy should be something inclusive, not exclusive. And South Korean diplomacy should be inclusive, especially between the values, to combine the values and interest. And we should also play a certain role as a proactive stance. And the diplomatic maneuverability is also very much important to the future of the South Korean foreign policy. What I'm trying to say is that maybe Indo-Pacific area, we are deeply concerned with the Indo-Pacific area, in terms of area. So we've been performing the new Southern policy since the birth of the Moon Jae-in government. New Southern policy was born in that context. It was designed to go to reach to the region of the Southeast Asia as well as India, because we even believe that the South Korean diplomacy was so much entrapped by the, traditionally entrapped by the four major powers, So we like to go beyond that, four major powers to reach to the, Pacific, to reach to the Southeast Asia. So since during the last 4 years under the Moon Jae-in government, the new Southern policy has been partially very much successful because we've been, our president has emphasized the key 3 words, 3 P's: people, prosperity, and peace. So we've been, Indo-Pacific area has been connected to our new diplomacy here. Second part, maybe I like to use 2 more minutes to to explain my argument that if it is a symbol of coalition, the connotation of the Indo-Pacific. Many Koreans believe that this is something important and something else because it symbolizes that a certain coalition, especially this means Indo-Pacific means that anti-Chinese coalition. Anti-Chinese coalition is important, but in South Korea, it is. Even though we've been pursuing the strong bilateral alliance with the United States, that our relationship with China, it is also very much important to South Korean's economy. So maybe it would be fair to say that maybe South Korea would be last country to join if we believe it is inevitable, or even it is if it would be unavoidable, we would join the so-called coalition of Indo-Pacific, but we would be the last country to join that because we try to maintain the alliance, military alliance with the United States, but at the same time we try to maintain the strategic partnership with China because we have a very much huge economic interest in China. Of course, many South Korean believes that we do not want to be dependent. Our economy, South Korean economy, should not and could not, wholly dependent on Chinese economy. So we like to diversify our coalition, and friendship with the other countries. That's why the Indo-Pacific area matters in this regard to the Koreans now. Maybe I'll stop here.
Dr. Kim, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for that really wide-ranging but succinct overview of Korean views. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Hill now.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you especially for inviting me to KEI and to have this opportunity to actually meet with friends and colleagues after so many months when we could not do so. But it's a great pleasure to see on the screen Professor Kim after many years, and I can see he's still doing very well, and great to see you. It's instructive, really, that we are sitting here discussing an issue that is as broad as the locations of our various speakers. The Indo-Pacific is quite an extraordinarily large area. When I went to school, we talked about the Pacific Ocean, we talked about the Indian Ocean. We did not have a concept of Indo-Pacific. So in a sense, it's kind of a new concept, and a concept that I think understandably has raised a lot of questions, as Dr. Kim's presentation suggests, questions for some of the middle-sized states in the Indo-Pacific, questions for sort of whither ASEAN, because ASEAN is right there in the middle of this. So I think there is much to discuss, and perhaps in that context, much to try to address. It is interesting that there's more discussion of what this cooperation is not rather than what it is. And of course, this gets into the question that Dr. Kim raised, which is the enormous question of China. Those who came to Asian architecture questions via Europe will be struck by some of the similarities, and of course, that Europe faced in the post-World War II area, but of course, many of the dissimilarities. When Europe put together the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, which was essentially a French-German concept, but it also included medium-sized powers. And to the extent one can describe Luxembourg as small, I think it's fair to say it put together some small powers as well. And I think it was an effort to address history, an effort to address economy, and also an effort to address the future to ensure that in coordinating economic policy, there could never be the kind of breakdown that caused two world wars to start in Europe. Beyond that, though, I think the Indo-Pacific ideas kind of part with this European pedigree, and rather the Indo-Pacific areas get into a lot of very fundamental questions that have not been resolved. Of course, Dr. Kim put into play the question of China. Is this an association of democracies that are a sort of counterbalance to China? For those who protest that proposition, there are many who are interested in it because they think that is what it's about, that it's kind of a crypto security architecture. And so that is probably going to need to be addressed in the context of what is best for security in the Asia Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. Is it best for security to have a kind of counterbalance, or should it be looked at in terms of addressing broad issues such as climate change? And actually, it was, I think it's true, there was a cooperation among these 4 countries in the wake of the tsunami. I don't think it was kind of consciously understood. It was more understood who's got the capability of bringing supplies to the countries hardest hit by the tsunami. But certainly the issue of climate change and other natural catastrophes was very much in the mix. I can recall, however, very much when we were in various ASEAN, for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum, where we tried to have some sort of joint projects that would address some of the search and rescue type of issues that would involve the various militaries of ASEAN. We did some tabletop exercises, didn't really get to the issue of real cooperation on the ground or in maritime areas. So a lot of work that needs to be done there. I think for a medium-sized country like Korea, I think if I were Korean, I would be concerned to make sure that this is some kind of community with an open architecture and a community that aims to be enlarged on the basis, to be sure, of interests and values, but also on the basis of what is in the broader context, what is best for the peace and security of the region. There needs to be some kind of mechanism for taking up the question of China's interests and, frankly, of China's ambitions in the region. So it's a very broad concept. Broad concepts are good, but they often raise a lot of suspicions, and at the very least raise an awful lot of questions that I think need to be better addressed than they have been to date. So I'll stop now and.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Hill. That's great. Yeah, I think you've also now added some questions that I think we'll get into in our discussion. Is that on the one hand, we have this broad idea of the Indo-Pacific, and at the same time, there's so much focus, at least my sense is in Korea, I'm not sure about other countries, on the Quad and what that means. So I think there's that tension too between that sort of broader sense of shared interests and values, and that sense of, is this about a new organization that's just going to become more and more institutionalized? But Admiral Swift.
Well, first of all, thank you for this great opportunity to KEI and your leadership here. I had a list of things I wanted to talk about. I thought I was going to talk about, and it's changed already just based on the two previous speakers. I think that speaks to both the richness of the individuals that are drawn to participate, as well as their insights. I want to be brief because I'm really interested in getting to the Q&A portion and teasing out what's in the margins of the challenges that we face. It's interesting as I look at the title of this, Navigating Troubled Waters, and then I see naval vessels steaming through the sea. I find it useful that as a retired military officer to comment about my concerns about turning too often to a military tool to address what are issues in other domains, diplomatic domains, economic domains, personal information. And I would also suggest where there's instability, there's opportunity. But to take advantage of that opportunity, I think there needs to be a deeper understanding of the challenges that we face individually and collectively. It's the royal we, it includes the PRC, and to expand that dialogue. I'm involved in a couple of other dialogues, but they are unique. They're not as broad as they need to be. Competition is not a bad thing if we understand what the rules are. It's true in professional sports. In fact, we know what the rules are as professional teams, and we still need umpires to help us navigate that path. So competition can make us all better. It's not just about the maritime domain. The competition exists in many other domains. When we talk about freedom of navigation, I'm quick to point out that the challenge of navigating freely is just as apparent outside the maritime domain and the economic domain, the information domain, the diplomatic domain. So we need to expand the conversation beyond that. Very interesting, the concept of people, prosperity, and peace. I often talk from a military perspective. Military's expertise is really providing security, either to sustain the stability that already exists or regaining stability where it's diminished to a point of concern. So security for security's sake, in my mind, has little value. Both military leaders and, more important, the civil leaders that are in charge of the military, the focus should be on the stability of the region, and then how do we use all the instruments of national power to maintain that stability. And the reason that stability is so important is because that's what begets prosperity. So there's a common interest here. There's a nexus of interest regardless of what your national perspective may be, to include China, to include Russia, to include Iran, the others that sometimes we're critical of. The maritime is a gray zone that we don't have the insights. The continental power was discussed earlier, but the maritime itself is a gray zone. There's uncertainty about what's happening in that space, and nations can control the description of those activities. And so there's a danger there because the unintended consequences of a tactical action that occurs in that gray area, if it becomes apparent and is unacceptable from a national perspective, especially the citizens of a nation, there's very little maneuver space left for senior leaders to manage that challenge, especially in today's world that has become so polarized. That's why I think discussions like this are so critically important. I could not agree more with any coalition allowing itself to be categorized or to consider itself as anti-anything. That is in everyone's worst interest. So that discussion, it's very important that we're clear and concise as to why alignments would occur between nations. I think it's very important when I speak about China, I use that term in reference to the Chinese people. And too oftentimes, I think we further polarize our discussions by characterizing them as issues with the people of a specific nation. What we have issues with are the rules that are applied from a governance perspective, mainly outside a nation's borders. There are concerned with rules within the borders as well. And that takes me down the path with this reference to China. Is it's important if you're talking about governance, you're talking about the PRC. If you're talking about what drives the PRC, you're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. And then you were talking about Xi Jinping, and I think there's too much a sense of this unanimity between the CCP and their president. We have disunity within our own country, and that disunity occurs in other countries, to include China as well. So better understanding that is important. The last thing I'll say is, with any democracy, there are many tools in a national toolbox. And I think one of the last tools to reach for is a military tool to resolve instability that is occurring amongst the other domains that the tools apply to. I mentioned them: economic, diplomatic, human rights is one. There's many in that box, but that military tool should be the last one that we reach for. It's critically important from a deterrence perspective, deterrence to allow diplomacy to work. But for that reason alone, I'm very happy to have received the invitation to participate in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Swift. You've made a lot of important points we want to come back to. I'm going to turn to the first of our two discussants now, Dr. Tellis, to comment on what we've heard so far and to add a little more, I hope, especially about the Indo and Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here back actually at KEI after many, many years, and absolutely wonderful to see Ambassador Hill and Admiral Swift. Not to mention my old friend Lisa and Professor Kim, whom I'm meeting virtually for the first time. I want to make 3 points in the context of this discussion. And the first is about the Indo-Pacific itself. I think it's really a testament to American success and Chinese success simultaneously. The United States, at the end of World War II, set out to rebuild a war-torn Asia. And that success has been seen in 3 waves. In the first wave, it was Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese reconstruction. In the second wave, it was the tigers of Southeast Asia. And in the third wave, it was the rise of China, followed a few decades later by the rise of India. And so the unification of the Indo-Pacific is really a testament to a steadily enlarging sphere of prosperity that began in Northeast Asia and now has reached South Asia and hopefully will go beyond. I think it's equally a testament to China's success, because if China had not been as successful, the unification of the Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean would not have taken place. We would have been talking about the Asia Pacific for many decades if China had not been the success that it's become. And it's the expansion of Chinese interests beyond the East Asian periphery into the Middle East, into the Indian Ocean area, into Africa, particularly the East Coast of Africa, that actually has resulted in the unification. And in fact, there is a gentle irony in all of this, that although the United States is often associated with the concept of the Indo-Pacific, it's, in my view, actually a Chinese creation. And the United States has only responded, in fact, probably 10 years after the concept of the Indo-Pacific became real. So in many ways, this is a tribute to the success of 2 countries, and it ought not to be forgotten. There is a huge arc of prosperity, which has slowly unfolded since 1945. And the central strategic challenge now is how one protects that arc of prosperity in the face of change, right? So that's point number 1. Point number 2, whether we like it or not, it is about China. And it is about China in the best and in a troublesome sense. In the best sense, because you have a new rising power that has benefited from global interdependence. That is a huge gravitational mass that has linked all the countries on its periphery, and which really in some ways poses new challenges for international politics. We're all comfortable with the metaphors of the Cold War. And the Cold War in many ways was unique because we never had interdependent relations with our adversaries. So the Soviets had a little clique of their own, we had a clique of our own, and we managed to compete without any interconnections whatsoever. today, whatever China's ambitions may be, those ambitions are now being expressed in a world where it is deeply tied with all the countries on its periphery, including its supposed rival, the United States. And so how one manages competition in an area of deep interdependence, I think is going to be the central challenge in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And I would argue that we haven't yet broken the code for how to engage in competition amidst structural cooperation. And the Cold War analogy sharply reaches its limits when one reaches this kind of a world. Because if you consider China to be a competitor or even an adversary, the question of how one competes with an adversary where you have deep economic linkages with is going to be a challenge that the United States faces, and not just the United States, but every one of our Asian partners, which has very deep ties with China. So the nature of competition in the world to come in the Indo-Pacific is going to be very different from anything that we've seen in the last iteration of global competition. And we have to figure out how to make this work. The third point, I think it is the object of US strategy, whether it is articulated or not, that successful competition amidst interdependence in the Indo-Pacific space is going to require the creation of a genuine multipolarity in Asia. And that is because we do not have the luxury of containing China anymore. We could contain the Soviet Union, as I said, because we had no economic ties. We cannot contain China because we are deeply intertwined with China. And none of our partners, whatever they profess, can afford to contain China, one, because they're weaker than China, and two, because they continue to rely on China for their own prosperity. So given that fact that containment is essentially ruled out, what is the alternative strategy for managing the rise of a new great power? And it seems to me that the only strategy that's out there is to maintain an Asia which is not dominated by China alone, but which has room for other powers on China's periphery. And I would put the Republic of Korea as one of those powers. I would put Japan. I would put at least one or two key nations in Southeast Asia, of course, India, and the United States, which is a resident power. So when one thinks about the Indo-Pacific and the discussions about the Quad, I see this as part of an evolution where there is a struggle to institutionalize new forms of cooperation that would reflect the multipolarity of the region. Will this be the last word on the subject? No. Will this be the sole device that guarantees successful multipolarity? No. But I think we are at this point because Asia does not have the European experience of having a continent-wide set of institutions where we are condemned to sort of work with the alphabet soup of arrangements. And there will be a proliferation of such arrangements. And I see the Quad as just being one more of those arrangements. It will not be the final guarantee of security. In an ideal world, it would be an open institutional arrangement. Of course, that depends on the consensus views of the members. But again, I see this as the United States and its partners struggling and groping to create institutional arrangements that meet the challenges of the day. And to my mind, the central challenge of the day is how do you protect a multipolar system in Asia that preserves a balance of power that is still open to allow for Chinese prosperity while still acting as a check on the worst of Chinese ambitions. And so this is an open-ended project. You know, the last word has not been said.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, it is open-ended. I'm thinking of when Ambassador Hill and I were in government, and he negotiated with the six-party talks. And part of it, we remember the North Korea denuclearization part, but sometimes we forget that there was something in there about multipolarity, as you put it, multilateral. But at that time, the idea was China could be a part of this. The big change, of course, is I think right now there's a sense that really China can't be, but we'll get into that. Okay. last but not least, in terms of our initial interventions, is Dr. Okar, which thank you so much again for joining us. This is a perfect segue, I think, into the European experience or perspective and your perspective on the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this important event. I will continue on the theme of middle powers. I'll talk about South Korea's relations with other Indo-Pacific middle powers, of which I would consider Europe to be one. South Korea and EU relations have grown strong since they established a strategic partnership in 2010. South Korea is the only country to have both political free trade and security agreements with the European Union. EU-South Korea Free Trade Agreement was the EU's first trade deal with an Asian country. The EU is South Korea's biggest foreign direct investor, and the EU is South Korea's third largest export market. In the security arena, South Korea and the EU have also strengthened cooperation, for example, in the fields of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, in cybersecurity, in space policy and technology, and in preventive diplomacy and crisis management. How come that this relationship has developed so strongly, so quickly? Well, I think that EU-South Korea relations are a good example of two Indo-Pacific middle powers which have built a strong partnership because they both seek to enhance their role in the Indo-Pacific security arena, starting from a relatively weak position. If you look at Europe, due to China's economic importance, which was mentioned earlier, the EU has been quite reluctant to treat China as a strategic threat. The EU is a global economic heavyweight that's able to push back at Chinese industrial and economic policies, but it's only just starting to do so now. In the security arena, until recently, the European footprint in the security arena mostly relied on French and UK naval diplomacy, but this is slowly starting to change with the publication of Indo-Pacific strategies this year by the EU, by Germany, and by the Netherlands. And they all embrace and support a European security footprint in the Indo-Pacific. I was deployed on the French carrier Charles de Gaulle in the Indo-Pacific in 2019 for more than a month. And I think that made it clear to me that France is a de facto quasi-partner of the Quad. But of course, the wider European Union cannot and will not have such a relationship. Instead, though, what the EU does is to strengthen its footprint by supporting efforts of France and others by building strategic partnerships, by entering into free trade agreements, and by implementing connectivity projects with what you can call like-minded Indo-Pacific middle powers, such as South Korea. And so adopting a sort of whole of government approach to the Indo-Pacific, if you like. South Korea is in a similarly awkward position as the EU, security-wise, being bogged down in the North Korean nuclear issue and the continuous threats emanating from Kim Jong-il's regime, which is again on the rise with the breakdown in talks and China's de facto support for North Korea. South Korea's geographic location, of course, puts it in a difficult position, which makes it reluctant to join the Quad, as was mentioned, because it's likely to trigger a very negative response from China. And another reason for South Korea's skepticism towards the Quad is, of course, its strained relations with Japan, although in many ways, Tokyo would be a desirable partner for Seoul. Hence, South Korea looks for partnerships with other Indo-Pacific middle powers, such as the European Union, but also India and Australia, who are similarly exposed to security and economic challenges from China. Such middle power relations in the Indo-Pacific, I think, should be encouraged by the US. Washington needs allies in that region who are sufficiently strong to operate independently from the US, and allies that can take action on economic and security challenges without always having to call on the US before doing anything. And I think that requires building such networks. Of course, independent middle power relations will mean that the agendas of these partnerships are sometimes not aligned with US interests. So for example, trade might be diverted away from the US and towards these middle powers, and the instruments that are used to manage, for example, challenges from China may differ from those preferred by the United States. However, such differences should not prevent the US from recognizing that the benefits of such relationship outweigh the costs. Indeed, middle power relations, in my view, are a necessary development in establishing networks between US allies and partners, which can add up to a formidable force for maintaining a free and open and diverse Indo-Pacific across a wide range of issues. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much. That's terrific, and I think a great follow on to some of the points that that Ashley was making. I have a lot I'd like to respond to, but I'm mindful it's creeping towards practically midnight in Seoul, and I do want to give Dr. Kim maybe the first opportunity, if he'd like to take it, to make some comments. I hope we can have some discussion among ourselves, and we're going to have, I think, some questions that have come in from our watching audience. But you know, if I may say, Dr. Kim, please comment as you like, but I'd love for you to take up some of the points that that were made by Liselott and by Ashley just now in terms of these various multilateral arrangements, and my own observation. This is coming from me, that in Korea and South Korea, there seems to be a lot of energy, which sometimes in Washington we don't notice, but a lot of energy in building ties with Europe, with the European Union, with India for that matter, with others. And you mentioned the New Southern Policy, but even outside of that, and there's not the same. There seems to be it seems to be more comfortable for South Korea to do that than to address a question like the Quad. Is that a correct perception? And how do you see, as South Korea does pursue this kind of diplomacy that you described in historical and current terms, its efforts vis-a-vis other kinds of multilateral arrangements, ad hoc or more formal?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Stevens. Well, actually, I learned a lot. I mean, I did. As I mentioned, maybe we've been speaking of the South Korean foreign policy in terms of some kind of concept or even terms. But I didn't realize that people like you, witnessing the South Korean diplomatic activities is very widely well known to the people in Washington, or even the outside world. Maybe theoretically or conceptually, maybe that was we call it maneuverability of South Korean foreign policy. That's where we're aiming, to do that. Well, I don't know. Maybe, our position with regard to the Quad is very sensitive question, actually. Or even, as I said, Indo-Pacific. The term Indo-Pacific, even though it is, in a sense, it means, it describes a region that we should reach to. But when we say Indo-Pacific, maybe this is something that the power coalition, as you mentioned, the multilateral coalition or multilateral arrangement, to vis-a-vis the China. Recently in South Korea, it is kind of a social mood we've been experiencing our difficult times or even good times in the, during the days of the Cold War. As you know, South Korea has been, standing at the, front line in the Northeast Asia. So when people talk about the possibility of, emergence of the new Cold War, many people believe that it is inevitable as long as we're concerned with the, Sino-American rivalry has been intensified, or even maybe we should, maybe even though we like to maintain successfully the bilateral alliance with the United States, but in emergence of the new Cold War types of international order, maybe we should, if we can, we should avoid that kind of emergence. So maybe the term or the word Quad is like a very sensitive word to ask ourselves whether to join the Quad or not. Or some people say that South Korean position is Quad and plus something. We do not want to be regarded as something plus. Or it sounds like something periphery. If we decide to join the Quad, it should be a penta. The 5 powers to make some kind of arrangement. So in South Korea, we've, I don't know, it is some kind of a coercive request, to ask ourselves to choose this or that, to choose this country or that country. Maybe this is a framework of, coercive question. But as we've been asking ourselves, and we've been trying to answer to the question. During that process, we believe that our strategy in the field of foreign policy would be developed. Middle power. I mean, theoretically yes, in practice yes. But in our generation, still South Korea believes is relative small power. As you know that according to our older terms, older saying that small would be easily burst among the big whales fight. That's the so still South Koreans' mentality. Partially, it is we believe that we are very we've been in a position of a small power. So what I'm trying to say is we've been very sensitive to the outside response, outsiders, outside powers activities. So when the European friends called us as a middle power, I'm very glad to hear that. Maybe we should prefer that how to behave like the middle power. But I think we are still learning. Maybe this is my question as well as a comment as to Dr. Tallis. I think your comment is very much interesting. I think you're a historian, to explain very complicated things in a very brief way. Do you think that as you said, that the U.S. strategy against the Soviet Union, that we call it, this is containment. Maybe containment was successful partially, but in containment would not be possible against China because intertwined conditions between the U.S. and China, maybe China and the outside world. So what would be the name of a strategy or concept of strategy in between the containment and the engagement? Or can you say this is hawkish engagement or dovish engagement? Or what would be a middle position between the containment policy? If you think that the containment is not containment policy would not be possible against China, and if you think that engagement is Washington's engagement has already failed. So what would be a position in terms of a strategy?
Actually, I'll turn turn to you on that and maybe others as well. I'm just going to inject. We have from the audience a number of questions that kind of refer to the economic element of that. I think it goes back to something that Scott was saying about, this is not about the military only, and the convergence between the kind of the economic and security issues is something that I think is very much on people's minds. But yeah, it's a great question.
A few years ago, I'd written a small monograph that actually addressed this question. And what I argued was that the middle path is essentially balancing. And balancing allows you to engage openly in those issue areas where there is no conflict of interest. But it also allows you to resist to the degree necessary in those issue areas where there are conflicts of interest. And this is not a new concept that I've invented. I mean, it goes back to Henry Kissinger and the search for equilibrium. I remember Condi Rice made that famous speech at the Manhattan Institute, I think in the early 2000s, where she talked about a balance of power that favors freedom. So the idea was that balancing preserves the capacity to engage with all parties, including your competitors and including your adversaries, while still putting in place those military capabilities and institutional restraints that would be necessary to prevent your adversaries from doing harm to your core interests. And so as long as we keep the concept of maintaining a favorable balance of power, I think that provides enough freedom for us to be able to engage with China and to continue to engage with China in the economic space and elsewhere, while still, upholding our commitments to our allies and to those countries that are bystanders, that rely on US power, particularly in the Indo-Pacific space, for their own freedom. And so it is a tightrope walk. There's going to be it's not an equation where you get a discrete answer. You have to work this out in every situation and in every circumstance. But we have no alternative. I mean, that's the point. The point is we have no alternative, because the easy alternatives of pure engagement and pure containment are simply impossible to sustain in the current environment.
Let me back into answering the question specifically. And this is more in Ashley's lane. This first point here is that I think it's critically important that we think strategically, plan operationally, and act tactically. Those are military terms, but to polarize this a little bit, I don't think the U.S. has a grand strategy. There is an interesting op-ed in the LA Times just yesterday about this that I think is quite good. The title of the op-ed is "Grand Strategy Has a Bad Rap. To fix it, we need to get beyond hard power and traditional statecraft," which I read into your comments, Ashley. What's most important is to have a strategic vision that you can articulate. And I think that gets after this problem of the middle powers, because the middle powers aren't quite sure, I guess that I'm uncomfortable with it, but where the great powers are, both China and the United States. As an aside, I don't like the term Indo-Pacific. It leaves out the critical middle. I think all three parts are critical. I prefer Indo-Asia Pacific because I think it highlights this point of middle powers, and they're critically important for many reasons, economic in particular. It's very important. This discussion of quads, change the names, change the context, change who's participants in it. But it's critically important now, because of where the world is, that we make change from inside an organization rather than standing outside an organization and critiquing it. It limits your credibility. And I think the United States has been guilty of this, certainly in the recent history. The Cold War model will not work. Containment is against anybody's best interest, including the United States. So where there are perceptions of containment, we have to ask ourselves, was that the intended action of the strategy? And if so, let's have a deeper discussion of what that strategy is with allies, partners, and friends. I would say that 80% is a good enough solution. That may not be relevant from a diplomatic perspective, but 80% is good enough 90% of the time now, because we don't have the luxury of time. We need to move forward with a sense of urgency, not panic, not rushing. We need to be thoughtful, but we need a sense of urgency. I mentioned the containment piece. It's that it won't work. So here's my suggestion. Look in those areas. Instead of what we do is we look at where there's differences between China and the United States. Look at where there's convergence, where there's agreement of things that we can work together. COVID is one, and yet we've weaponized COVID response to some extent. That's not useful. We should be focused on solutions. Look at where those areas of convergence and agreement are first. Demonstrate that you can work together, and then drive out to the more polarizing elements that is driving the US-China relationship, recognizing it's limiting the maneuver space of the middle powers to play a more proactive role in stabilizing the situation beyond what we are now.
Yeah, I thought I'd make a couple of comments. First of all, to hear Dr. Kim talk about the anxieties of a middle power finding middle positions. And I think this does come to the issue where countries do not want to choose among blocs. I mean, they would like to see perhaps more integration in the region. And I think the architecture of Asia, the time has come for more architecture. But I think one has to be careful not to confuse integration and architecture with some kind of collective defense ideas. And in Korea's case, having an alliance with the United States is a pretty excellent defensive alliance. I think it meets many of Korea's needs. And frankly, for us, combined with our alliance with Japan, I think it really kind of helps keep us in the game and in the region. The issue really is, can we take this Indo-Pacific or Indo-Asian Pacific and use this concept to encourage more integration? Again, I don't want to lean too heavily on what happened in Europe, but it is interesting in Europe that you have an integrative process provided by a organization or sets of organizations that had nothing to do or little to do with the security, that being in NATO. So I think there is reason to be concerned that in the creation of a greater sense of community, of integration, that it is accompanied by worries of where China is going. And there are reasons to be concerned that in worrying about China's direction, we may also be creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of where China goes. So I think the answer is architecture and approaches that seek to keep China in mind as we go forward, and not just the protestations that the Quad has nothing to do with China may not suffice. And there may need to be a little more effort to make sure that the collective, for example, view in China of encirclement, a concept they worried about in their relations with Russia, and a concept that the Kissinger team dealt with and used, I think, to great advantage. We have to be careful that it doesn't look like a replay of a kind of encirclement, but this time through maritime powers. I think we have to respect people's fears and apprehensions as we embrace people's optimism about a more integrated region. I think there should be a bigger role for Europe in this, and I would hope we will see that in the future, and not just among through French maritime assets or German industrial assets, but rather through a broader, more comprehensive notion, because if there's anything that the pandemic has taught us, it's the concept that we're all in this, mothership of the earth together.
Thank you. I want to turn back to Lisa and get the kind of perspective from Europe one more time, and perhaps Dr. Kim to some of what you've heard. And then I want to do kind of a final lightning round, in a sense, to give you a warning on the Quad and maybe advice for President Moon or President Biden later this week, because I know that the Quad will be much featured, at least in the reporting in Korean newspapers about the summit. But first, Lisa, as I listen to this and thinking about we were saying some things remain unspoken, sometimes a little unspoken about China and how China figures into this, but also, ironically, maybe unspoken in the United States is questions about the United States and about its reliability, its commitment. And again, our Korean friends, I think, always give us the benefit of the doubt on this as well. But when I look at some of the ties that are budding so quickly, it seems to me, bilateral, multilateral, Europe and Asia and so on. Is there a little bit of hedging in this? Is there a little bit of a sense that, maybe the US is not on the right track in the way that maybe it is really on a containment track that's not going to work, and we've got to provide an alternative. I may be just trying to provoke a comment from you on that, but I wonder if that's part of the explicit or implicit conversation in Europe and across Europe and Asia.
Yes and no. I think Europe, as other middle powers, realize that they should not always wait around for US leadership, and that there is value to be had in, what you can perhaps describe as a more balanced European approach, which very much tries to grapple with the fact that there is a lot of problematic things coming out of China and a lot of serious challenges. But we cannot cut off our economic and industrial relations with China. So somehow we have to find a way to kind of push back at these more illicit Chinese behaviors while still maintaining cooperation with China. And I think the middle powers in some ways have had better answers to that challenge and better strategies. They're not perfect. And as I said, both South Korea, for example, but also Europe are latecomers to this. But the good news is that Europe will definitely stay in the Indo-Pacific and develop its engagement. And it will do so across a whole range of issues, because Europe is an economic heavyweight, not a military heavyweight. That doesn't mean we should not have some kind of presence, because I think you will see that presence develop as well, the naval diplomatic presence. But Europe is developing mechanisms to make it stay and to be supportive of individual member states' contributions to make this work best, because the US is, of course, still a preferred partner for all these democratic middle powers. I think there needs to be a focus on more coordination and, how do you align the strategies Europe uses to deal with China challenges with those that are preferred by the United States and are sometimes more upfront and more reliant on hard power. Because I think if you combine these approaches, then I think it can be a very effective way of not excluding China, but pushing back against the behaviors we all agree in the democratic world are problematic, and then at the same time engage China and be willing to cooperate it on certain issues.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to circle back around. We're already at a point where we're kind of probably to people's last intervention. So I welcome people to say whatever they'd like to, but I'm going to, and I think I'll give Dr. Kim the last word here, since we began with him, and I think we should end in Seoul, where it's already night. You're a little ahead of us. But we have gotten back to the Quad. I said I was, and I do think that it maybe gets more attention than it really should. But that seems to be something the Biden administration is really. I'm looking at everybody here.
Could I ask
Yeah,
Ashley,
okay,
though,
sure.
maybe to talk about India's aspirations?
Well, there is that.
For the Quad. India has a lot of issues with China, maritime, but also continental. And India, I just don't know to what extent India has followed, Japanese, Chinese maritime problems or these other issues in the Western Pacific. So
That's actually an interesting question, because in many ways, India is the unique entity in the Quad. That is, we have alliance relations with Japan, we have alliance relations with Australia. India finds itself in an interesting position, and India's participation in the Quad is a function of trying to balance two competing realities. On one hand, India is a very strong advocate of an open Indo-Pacific. So if you listen to the Prime Minister's address at Shangri-La many years ago, he was very careful to create a notion of the Indo-Pacific that would have room for China. Very conscious that they define the Indo-Pacific in an open way. However, I think in practical terms, they've reached the conclusion that Chinese actions have ended up making or sort of pushing China outside the pale of what we consider to be the rules-based Indo-Pacific order. So because the Chinese have, in a sense, positioned themselves outside the pale, India now feels free to join plurilateral arrangements that could protect its own interests. So it doesn't see the plurilateral arrangements as essentially the last word on the subject, but it sees it as an interim solution for protecting its security until Chinese behaviors change. And so in that sense, they're completely open to an evolution which sort of accommodates a full Chinese presence in the Indo-Pacific space. But for the moment, it's going through this period where it's looking for various partnerships in order to just protect its interests.
In some ways, that sounds not dissimilar, like the kind of search that South Korea is on, notwithstanding the fact that it is an ally of the United States. But so that takes me to, right, the question of the Quad. And I guess I'd say, maybe I should start with you. We'll kind of go around. What do you think would be a good outcome for South Korea in the short term vis-a-vis this? I have to, I'm not going to, I have to say, just as a kind of a matter of marketing, and Dr. Kim was kind of referring to this, but if you have something, you say, oh, it's really informal, it's evolving, but then you make it capital T, capital Q, the Quad, and the Quad means a number, you're immediately questioning, well, what comes after 4 and what comes after that? It's just not the best way to start for the kind of vision I think that you were describing. But what would be your advice or your thoughts on that?
I would make 2 points. One, whatever the evolving architectures of Asia are, they will not succeed if they do not reflect an underlying foundation of favorable power. And this is where the role of the United States becomes really critical. To my mind, there's really no alternative to enlightened US leadership. Because if you don't have enlightened US leadership, the region essentially has to fend for itself. That's the upshot. And then if the region has to fend for itself, you cannot count on the better angels of our nature actually dominating politics, right? So we have to stay engaged. And to my mind, the alliance relationships that we have are critical. They're absolutely the foundation, which is another way of saying that the Quad, to me, is simply superstructure. I would not give it, I would not attribute mysterious powers to it. And I would not overinvest in it. What I do want is to keep the foundations of our alliance partnerships in good repair. Because if we can do that, then we can choose to engage in any multilateral organization as and when our interests demand, without making that, the new talisman for security. With respect to our South Korean colleagues, if I I'm presumptuous enough to give advice. I would simply say there is no need to rush to Quad membership. One, because the longevity of the Quad is still an open question. Its institutional design is still unclear. And there are many ways in which South Korea can secure its interests through partnerships with each of the individual members of the Quad, rather than wanting to join the Quad Qua organization. And so I would say, take a deep breath, wait and see where this goes, build the individual partnerships, especially with the United States, which to me is fundamental, and then let nature take its course. There will always be time to make adjustments as required. You don't have to force the outcome.
So a couple of comments I would make with respect to the Quad. First of all, moving away from certainly unilateralism to bilateralism is a positive step, but we need to move to multilateralism. And I think certainly from a trade sanction perspective, there's a strong argument to be made that the United States has recently pursued a path of bilateralism as far as our engagement. So this isn't, I don't see a big delta between those that are critical of China being bilateral and reluctant to pursue multilateral relationships and the United States. There's an interesting, in my engagements with friends in the region, there was a long discussion about the legitimacy of the United States, certainly as they observe the actions of the United States in the context of the region. There's a term that has been used a couple of times in conversations I've had about the relevancy of the United States, which should be very troubling. Because if you're not legitimate, I think it's much easier to recover in the definition of legitimacy of the minds of those that are in the region. It's much easier to recover from actions. But if you lose relevancy, it's a much more difficult path to recovery. It's interesting, the comment that was made about waiting around for U.S. leadership. I think we see that in TPP 11. One of my criticisms, I'm a big proponent of TPP. One of my criticisms of the original TPP is that China wasn't included. We should have included China. I would guess that they probably would not have participated because of the stipulations that were a part of the free and open system that trade structure was advocating for. This is what I would say specifically about Quads. It's about opportunity. I think it's a relic of the past, but it's the best structure that was available for those that were of interest to frame something around to move forward on. But to suggest that it's a model that will be applied going forward, I think to your point, that's very open. And I would encourage not just the Koreans. Actually, there's an opportunity for the Koreans and the EU to exercise leadership here, is to say, we're not buying into the Quad structure as it is now, but it's a great place to start. We appreciate where it is. And then we want to get engaged and have a discussion, an internal discussion about how we can modify this and make it more inclusive and more multilateral. It's interesting, the comment that you made, I could not agree with you more. We talk about, I think that US leadership is critically important. I'll go out on a limb and say, I think enlightened US leadership is what's lacking. And we can enlighten ourselves by listening to others in forums such as this, what their perspectives are, and maybe that's the best approach for Quads as well.
I can certainly see why the Quad presents some real challenges for Korea's notion of what it should be a part of. I think, though, Korea should consider a couple of facts, which is one, it's got an excellent relationship with the US. And I think it's very important that Korea preserve that, because I think it's really a very leveraging element for Korea in the region. Secondly, as that implies, I think Korea does need to be very active in any architecture in the region. Korea is active through ASEAN, sort of extended family organizations, and I think that's been very helpful to Korea to reinforce Scott's point that we're not just talking Indo-Pacific, we're talking Indo-Asia Pacific. So I think Korea has pretty good cachet in those ASEAN countries and should continue to do so. Finally, I think from Korea's perspective, as it views very carefully this Quad mechanism, and by the way, I'm with Ashley. I'm not sure 50 years from now we'll be talking about the Quad. We'll be talking about some kind of integrative process. We'll be talking about architecture. I'm not sure we're going to be talking about 4 sort of regional great powers, if you will. But I think it's very important for Korea to find a way forward with Japan. And I don't think it's helpful to Korea to have enmity with a Quad member. I really think some of these issues can be moved ahead. And I think that would be very much in Korea's interest. Beyond that, the best thing about the Quad is the concept that it is engaging US interests in the region. The worst thing that we've seen in recent years is a kind of strange detachment from the region. And that is not helpful to anybody, and I would argue especially the US. And here we are almost an hour and a half into this, and no one's mentioned North Korea. So what more appropriate person to do so than me? That's got to be fixed. It's got to be worked on. And for those who think it's hard to work with China, try working against China on this. So that does need to be addressed. It's a tough issue, and I absolutely support our Korean friends in believing that we ought to really continue to go after it. There's been, of course, a review of the policy. There's a lot of commentary of whether it's new or whether it's simply, rinse and repeat kind of situation. But we've got to address what is essentially one of, and there are a couple others, but one of the most destabilizing security issues in the region. And I hope that we can stay with some focus on that.
Important point. So, Dr. Kim, we're going to give you the last word. We do need another at least hour and a half, but we have an unbroken record of never having a conversation where we don't mention North Korea. So thank you, and it is very important, and China. But Dr. Kim, we'll give you the last word. And actually, even before I do that, I'll remind people that we're going to have another.
My last word will be very, very brief. Just one thing that I sincerely hope that KEI and Ambassador Stevens would arrange another meeting to discuss the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, how to deal with North Korea, and how to deal with China on that matter. Again, I learned a lot, and when we discuss South Korea as a middle power, it reminds me old days. That happens about 16 or 15 years ago when the ambassador here was, the American ambassador to Korea. It was when we were in the South Korea as a balancer in the Northeast Asia. So there was a huge debate was heated up on maybe you can recall that. So many people believe that balance or balancing or balancer in terms of the arrangement of power or structure. I rather counter-argued and gainsay that, South Korea is a balancer. We are going to play a certain role as a facilitator, initiator, or even mediator. That was what South Korea's future foreign policy is all about. And that idea has now realized as President Moon Jae-in, South Korea is a driver on the Korean Peninsula. I think that was also connected with the idea of South Korea as a middle power. So South Korea would something, a productive role in making this area more, more prosperity, more prosperous and more stable. Last thing that again I thank to the old members, participant, especially Dr. Talis, that you're saying is something, your statement gave us some kind of insight to me actually. So I learned that maybe this is we're witnessing some kind of a transitional period from when I like to talk about Quad. Maybe we're in a very initial stage in terms of informal consultation, something to make, in the future, in some kind of a multilateral arrangement in a more institutionalized way. That's fine. So I bought it. I agree with you that South Korea need a, deep breath. Maybe, we should look around. But the thing is that you said that, one of the main purpose of the Quad is that the focus on how to change the behaviors of China by forming that kind of informal, consultation mechanism. But I think that the changing courses of actions, changing courses of behavior, well, that is theoretically yes, but in practice it would be very much difficult. So we support that the values in terms of 같이, 같이 갑시다, 같이, values, democracy, free ride, multilateralism, or we support that idea. But in these values should be combined with some kind of a visual interest for making that more institutionalized multilateral arrangement from Quad or something else, or Penta or something else. So, you guys, the US, Washington, India, or even Tokyo, how to suggest this, the values, important values like, democracy or free trade, that could be how to combine with these values with, interest for the region, for the country. That would be the future goal, to induce South Korea to Quad or something, Penta or something. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Terrific sum up. Dr. Kim, Dr. Ogard, I want to thank you both for joining us and for your patience with our technical difficulties. I extend the same thanks for the forbearance of our group here. It's been terrific to get together in person and to have this conversation on screen and off screen. We look forward to seeing both of you in Washington or Seoul or elsewhere as we continue this discussion. Tomorrow, KEI will have another panel event with a new panel to look at something we have alluded to, but not really gone into depth, and that is ASEAN. And maybe even the concept of ASEAN centrality. Remember that? So I hope people will join us for that. I too like to have learned a great deal, have a lot to think about, and thank you all for your time. And yes, I too like the fact that kachi means Korea. And it also, if you pronounce Korean badly like I do, it means values. So you can say 같은 kachi 바탕으로 같이 갑시다. So thank you so much for that, and see you all soon.
Bye-bye.